Welcome back to Transrational Perspectives after a brief hiatus. I'm Noah Taylor.
My name is Sean Bryant. I'm from Canada and I'm joining you from South Korea.
What we'll be discussing today is the moral frame or the moral understanding of peace. But first, since it's been a while, I want to give a quick recap. In our last episode, we discussed the energetic conception of peace, which understood the world as essentially a related system with everything more or less at the same level. And when we saw a world of where the polarities perceived in the world, the task was to integrate those polarities, to seek for balance and harmony. And thus we had an understanding of peace based on harmony.
Yeah, and when I find that when dealing with students, talking about the moral, the families of pieces, like the energetic and moral understandings of pieces, I find that students often have a lot of confusion about what are moral pieces. And one way I like to understand it, or I like to visualize it, is thinking of like a circle, the circle of being, all of being, and the moral understandings begin to posit the creator, so the God, the divinity, as being outside of the circle of being. So this is the one of the fundamental differences in the worldview between energetic worldviews and moral worldviews. And then the relational aspect of energetic pieces then gets replaced by norms, by laws, by rules, because the relational aspects then become codified, which makes static structures. So in a way, if we are always finding peace by relating in a certain way, well, then that becomes over and over again, that becomes a static structure. And once it then becomes a static structure, we cannot adapt to what's in front of us in a relational way, but it becomes a norm that must be obeyed at all costs.
And the positing of this transcendental object, or this God point outside of our relations, our experience relations, allows us to separate these dualities and to perceive them not as two aspects of a whole to be integrated, but rather as things that can be understood as good or bad, right and wrong, allowing for a separation of group and out-group, so creating the us and them. Another interesting point about this particular conception of the world and an understanding of peace is that it also creates a specific role for experts whose job it is to interpret that understanding of God that is outside of the human experience and outside of relations. So it becomes someone's job, typically a priest or a religious professional, to interpret the will of God to the people, so that way they do not have the experience of divinity themselves, but rely instead on the experts to derive norms from this point outside of the relationships.
Yeah, which then brings us to the idea of the conception of time in moral perspectives. Again, coming back to this idea of the circle, everything in energetic perspectives is contained within the circle of being and the circle of existence. Moral perspectives emerge historically with the conceptions of a linear progression of time. So that then begins to create the idea that peace is not something we experience in the given moment, in the here and now, but is something that we will experience in the future, which is connected to the idea of justice. That is, I have been wronged in the past, and this will be made right at some time in the future. So then, peace, rather than being a lived experience that we experience subjectively in the moment, becomes something that will be experienced in the future. I'm going to talk about the one truth.
And so this codification of norms fused with the role of the expert in interpreting the will of the divine, also sitting within the context of what we would call a linear chronosophy, a linear understanding and experience of time. What it also creates is what we could call one truth, a truth in a capital T. And this means that there is no variation in truth itself, but rather the variation is only in the interpretations. And this opens quite a lot of ground for arguing or for creating conflict based on what is the correct interpretation of God's will, of God's being. And this fused with our ability to create these normative separations between good and bad, us and them, seen within a linear time, allows for us to feel wronged or to feel injustices in the past that we can feel hate for and in the present, and seek an ever-increasing amount of justice in the future to rebalance the scales of justice and injustice, which plays a highly problematic and very prevalent role in legitimizing violence. And this question of justice is, I think, one of the most important considerations as we move into looking at what are some of the important considerations for peace work and peace education when looking at the moral perspective of peace.
Yeah, one of the questions that always comes up for me in talking about this is if the idea of, if we have these polarities of good and evil, the promise of peace in moral perspectives is that we choose good over the evil. That making those choices, that is what will bring peace. Is we have two things that we can choose between, and the interpretation of what is morally correct, what is right and wrong, will lead us on the path to peace. And this can be problematic in the sense of having varied interpretations. Well, then which one becomes the one that's true?
And I think when trying to engage with the question of justice, it's really important to take a critical perspective and to go beyond what is self-evident and what seems like a good idea or seems correct. So when you make the argument that we should strive for more justice, it's something that sounds intrinsically good, right? Like it's everyone wants a more just world, but the amount of violence and the amount of conflict in the world that is precisely on this question of variation, of what Sean was saying, whose justice are we fighting for, and by what means are we fighting for it, and what happens when different understandings of justice conflict with each other. And this I think has shaped a lot of the field of peace work because of the deep religious motivations of many of the early founders of peace and conflict studies, and many of the original foundations of peace work, kind of in the larger sense, which were motivated by a sense of religiously inspired justice, but in the end have created many problems that have yet been untransformed.
Yeah, this is exactly what I say about a moral understandings and moral interpretations of peace, in that I can appreciate their own beauty and simplicity of knowing that if I follow the rules in a complex world, if I follow the rules, it will bring me to a good life, and it will bring me past peace and the bounties of the world. And yet, I do believe that this kind of worldview contains within it the seed of further conflict, precisely because of the monopoly of one truth. That is, if I know that I have the one truth, what happens when it bumps up against someone else's truth? Right? And getting back to this question, justice for whom? Whose justice? Right? Who is claiming that they have authority to say what is just? Because it's always based on the systems of normativity and of these interpretations of what is truly right or wrong in any given situation.
So, as we're discussing these peace families within the context of a transrational peace philosophy, which posits that peace exists in its plurality and in many different perspectives, it's not that the critiques of the moral view of peace invalidate it, but I think what's important to emphasize is that it requires a critical and nuanced understanding, because it's the peace through justice perspective is a highly prevalent view that shapes a lot of different ideologies and a lot of different efforts in the peace building and conflict resolution and conflict transformation field. And so we've previously discussed an energetic understanding of peace, which stresses the drive of systems towards harmony. And so far we've discussed the understanding of peace from a moral perspective, which recontextualizes the field of human relationships, posits a point of reference outside of those relationships, thus removing the impetus for us to relate to one another directly, and to then have to relate through experts and through norms derived from something that we ourselves cannot directly experience. So these are the first two perspectives that we've come to so far. And in our future episodes, we will be looking at the modern and the postmodern and the transrational understandings of peace, and then trying to integrate them all into what does it mean to look at these perspectives together as a whole, or as the landscape or topography, perhaps, of peace itself.
And hopefully, and revisiting some of these examples and tying them in to see how they change throughout these different interpretations.
So thank you for joining us for this episode, and we look forward to seeing you again on our next one.